A cowboy lived alone for years until two native girls gave him a reason to fight again. Before we ride into this story, take a moment to drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from, what town or city you're calling home tonight. And when you reach the end of this story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now lean back, get comfortable, and enjoy the story. She didn't knock, just stood barefoot in the snow, her sister clinging to her side, both wrapped in deer hide and silence. And though he'd buried his heart 12 winters ago, he opened the barn door anyway. The winter that didn't end. It had snowed for 6 days straight. Not the cruel kind, not the wind-whipped, blinding kind. This was slower, heavier, the kind of snow that settles in like a hush, covers everything in stillness, until even the fences look like old bones. Out on Wind Hollow, the prairie stretched quiet and wide, and the only flame still burning was tucked inside the stone walls of an old ranch house, licking gently at dry logs. Like it, too, was tired of holding on. Jedediah Boone lit that fire every night. Same rhythm, same ritual. He lit the lantern by the window. He combed his mare's mane in the barn. He carved another name into the stall post. Not of men, but of cattle he'd buried long ago. Not from habit, from loyalty, because once, a long time ago, someone had waited for him. And though she now rested beneath a cottonwood cross where no flowers grew, his promise hadn't been buried with her. He didn't speak much anymore. Didn't need to. The wind spoke enough for both of them. He had his fire, his chair, his horse, and the porch where he watched the seasons grow cruel, then disappear like breath on glass. No one had crossed his land in weeks. The trail had vanished beneath the snow. Even the crows had left, so when he saw the shapes, just two of them, dark against all that white, he thought they were wolves, until one stumbled and the other caught her. Not wolves, not ghosts, just girls. They stood at the edge of the barnyard, barefoot, wrapped in hides that had seen too many winters, threadbare shawls clinging to shoulders that didn't know rest. One was barely older than a child. The other had a scar across her lip, and eyes too sharp for pleading. Jed didn't call out, didn't wave them in. He simply lifted a hand, slow, not quite welcome, not quite warning, a gesture soft as breath. But it was enough. The older one nodded. He opened the barn door. They stepped inside, silent, sure. He didn't follow right away, just stood there in the snow, boots soaking through, watching the trail behind them, expecting a third figure to rise from the white, someone chasing, someone claiming. But the only thing behind them was silence and the wind. Inside, the barn was warmer, barely. The cow stirred but didn't protest. As the girls curled into her warmth, Jed set a tin cup of coffee by the post. Didn't speak, didn't ask if they understood, didn't care. The older girl took it with hands, cracked red from wind and cold. She didn't thank him, but she didn't spill it either. Back in the house, he left the door unlatched, not open. Just unlatched. That night, Jed didn't sleep, just sat in his rocker, whittling cedar until it fell in soft curls at his feet. No one made a sound. And yet, he kept hearing something, a whisper, in a language he didn't know, but felt. By dawn, they were standing on his porch, half frozen, shivering, heads bowed. And for the first time in 12 years, Jed opened the door before someone knocked. Part 1. The house that forgot how to listen. The door creaked like it hadn't moved in years. The girls stepped inside, slow, shoulders drawn tight from cold. And something older, the smaller one, Tisa, could barely walk. Her legs shook, and the older girl held her upright until they reached the hearth. Jed didn't speak, just pointed. They sat without asking. The older one crossed her legs on the floor. Tisa curled into the only chair, knees pulled to her chest like they might keep her from disappearing. It took 3 full hours before their hands stopped trembling. Jed busied himself with simple things. He poured beans into a battered pot, sliced bread with the blade he kept too sharp for show. He didn't look their way often, but he noticed Tisa flinched every time the fire cracked. The older one scanned for exits, not comfort, and neither one glanced at the scarf still hanging on the peg by the door. When he slid bowls across the table, they ate without haste, not like they were starving, more like they'd learned not to finish anything they couldn't pay for. Outside, the snow kept falling, not harsh, not howling, just steady, curling up against the windows, like it was listening. By the second morning, Tisa's fever broke. Jed had left a basin of water out on the porch, and when he came back, her hair was damp, cloths already wrung and drying across the railing. The older girl had cleaned everything, quietly, thoroughly, like someone who once lived in a place where things were meant to be clean and wanted to remember what that felt like. Jed leaned in the doorway, arms folded. She met his gaze, didn't flinch, didn't soften. Then she crossed the room, stood tall, and said the first word he'd heard from her, Chenoa. She pointed to the smaller girl curled near the fire. Tisa. Jed nodded. Jed. She tilted her head. Tried again. Jedadia. This time, she got it right. Later, when he saddled the mare to ride into town, Chenoa followed him halfway to the gate. Snow fell again, thin flakes, soft as lace. She stopped by the old fence rail, fingers curled around wood, worn smooth by time. You come back? She asked. Jed looked at her, hard-eyed, quiet. He nodded once. I light the lantern every night. Chenoa tilted her head, searching. Why? Jed didn't answer. He just rode off into the white in town. The general store felt colder than the trail, not from temperature, from people. Clovis Hatch spat on the floorboards near Jed's boots. You know what they are, he hissed. Comanche, maybe, or worse, traded girls. Dangerous. Jed didn't answer, just picked up flour, salt, beans, a tin of cherry tobacco, the kind his wife used to favor. The shopkeeper cocked a brow, expecting company. Jed shrugged. Depends how long the snow holds. Back home, the scarf was gone from the peg. He found it tucked in the cupboard, neatly folded beside the beans. He didn't mention it, didn't ask, but that evening, Chenoa wore it. Not like a prize, not like a relic, just worn. She stirred the beans while he chopped wood. Tisa sat by the fire, a tattered primer book in her lap. Jed didn't even remember owning it. She traced the words with a small finger, mouthing them softly, tripping on the hard ones. Jed watched. He listened, and for the first time in 12 winters, the house didn't feel hollow. That night, Jed lit the lantern again. Not for the woman he'd buried, not for the memories he couldn't fix, but for the simple, quiet truth that someone else was breathing under that roof now. And they didn't ask him to explain why he was still here. Part 2. What the wind carried in. The snow didn't fall that morning. It waited, hung heavy in the sky, like breath held too long, as if even the clouds knew something was coming and didn't want to interrupt. Inside the cabin, silence had taken root, not the kind that signals absence, but the kind that forms agreement. Chenoa swept the floor without being asked. Jed left a full pot of coffee warming on the stove, though he never once saw her drink it. Tisa slept easier now, her limp less pronounced, but still curling one hand against her sister's side each night. Like an anchor she hadn't outgrown, they moved around each other like coals in a banked fire, not burning, but still holding heat. Careful not to scatter, but outside, the world hadn't agreed to their peace. Jed felt it first, not in his ears, not in his eyes, in his chest, that old weight he trusted better than any forecast. He stepped outside. The tracks were back, not just one set, three, one heavy, one narrow, one dragging, the kind that told of a man who leaned on hate to walk. Jed didn't speak of it, didn't warn the girls. He just split more wood than necessary and tied the mare closer to the barn. That night, after Tiza drifted to sleep, Chenoa stepped out onto the porch. The snow whispered soft against the roof, her shoulders bare, the scarf still wrapped around her neck, like memory refusing to leave. Jed followed, said nothing, stood beside her, arms crossed against the cold. "You quiet," she said. "So are you?" She nodded, didn't smile. Then, after a long pause, "This safe place," he waited. "It's not far from the world," he said. "But yes, safer than most." She looked out across the white. "You alone?" "Long time. 12 winters." She closed her eyes, inhaled. "The kind of breath you take before saying something you've never said aloud." "I remember fire," she whispered. "Our old house, smell of deer stew. My mother used to sing." Then quieter. Then Trey came. "Not deer, dear. Girls." Jed didn't ask, didn't shift. "My uncle," she said flatly, "traded us for bullets." Her voice didn't break. It just thinned. Jed stared forward, jaw hard. "But you didn't ask," she said. "You didn't look." He nodded. "Slow. I've seen too much to stare." She touched his hand, light as ash. "You think we stay?" He didn't answer with words, but that night, he left the door, unlatched again. By morning, a wagon passed just beyond the tree line. Didn't stop, didn't slow. But word travels faster than wheels. By dusk, the sheriff had arrived. Jed was mending the gatepost when the hooves struck packed snow. Sheriff Arlen Crowley sat tall in the saddle, not hostile, but worn from carrying other people's burdens too long. Chenoa stepped onto the porch, didn't retreat, her braids still damp, swinging low against her back. "Town's uneasy," Crowley said, dismounting. "Says you're keeping Comanche girls." Jed didn't flinch. "They're not prisoners. Didn't say they were." The sheriff paused. "Are you claiming her?" Jed's jaw tightened. He glanced at the porch, at the lantern that hadn't yet been lit, then turned back. "I ain't sending her out into that." Crowley nodded once. "That's not what I asked." Long silence. Then, "She's mine." Not loud, not proud, just steady. A man building shelter, with 6 words and a gatepost. The sheriff studied him for a long beat, then tipped his hat. "Then make it official, before Clovis gets clever," and rode off into the trees. Jed stood there in the cold, still, until he heard soft steps in the snow behind him. "Chenoa." She didn't speak, didn't question, just looked at him, long and slow, then reached up, untied the blue scarf, held it out to him. "Then you give this to me again," she said. Like man gives gift, Jed took it, hands trembling, didn't fight it. He tied it around her neck again, careful, reverent, like someone remembering how to be trusted. They didn't speak of love, but it lived there, quiet, unshaken. In the gesture, Part 3. A place to stay. The days grew longer, but the snow didn't melt. It just settled, low and quiet, like even it had decided to stay a little while longer inside the cabin. Time didn't move fast. It circled. Mornings began with firewood stacked by the hearth, beans warming on the stove, and Tisa whispering her way through that tattered old primer. Afternoons passed in thread and stillness, mending things that couldn't be rushed, doing work that filled the air without needing to fill the silence. And each night, Jed lit the lantern, but not for memory anymore, for presence. 3 days after the sheriff rode off, the scarf disappeared again, but not into hiding. Chenoa wrapped it around Tisa's shoulders. When they stepped outside to breathe in the cold, It trailed behind the girl like a ribbon of sky, fluttering against the white. Jed saw it from the porch, didn't speak, but when Chenoa handed it back that evening, folded neat, he didn't hang it on the peg. He placed it on the table. Between them, a symbol now, not of grief, but of choice. They started eating at the table, together. No more sliding bowls across old wood. Jed pulled out the second chair. Tisa giggled at something Chenoa said in Comanche. Jed didn't ask what it meant. Didn't need to. He felt it. The house didn't echo anymore. It held, but peace rarely stays untouched for long. 2 nights later, Clovis Hatch showed up, horse snorting steam at the edge of Wind Hollow. He didn't dismount, didn't speak for a long moment, just stared across the gate. Chenoa stood on the porch. Tisa clutched her sleeve. Clovis spat into the snow. Didn't think you were the kind to keep scalps warm. Boone. Jed stepped out then, eyes quiet. Voice iron. Didn't think you were the kind to call it bravery when it's just noise. Clovis didn't answer, just turned his horse, rode off. But afterward, the cold felt sharper, like the wind had listened and decided not to forget. That night, after Tisa had drifted to sleep, Chenoa took off the scarf again, set it gently on the table, still lighting the lantern. She asked. Jed nodded. Why? He looked into the flame, not at her, because someone might need to find their way. She stood still a long time. Then, I stayed long enough. He blinked. Long enough for what? To not be guessed anymore. She didn't ask it like a question. She just let it sit, warm and unfinished. Between them, Jed reached for the scarf, tied it around her shoulders once more. Slower this time, like a second vow, made with hands instead of words. You're not a guest. She didn't answer, just leaned forward, pressed her forehead to his, soft and certain, then turned, walked away, without looking back. Outside, the wind shifted, not bitter, not sharp, just different, like it had finally decided to carry something home instead of away. Part 4. Where the light stays on. Spring didn't arrive with flowers. It came quietly, in the way snow softened beneath bootsteps, in the way birds returned without ceremony, in the way Jed left his coat unbuttoned for the first time in months. The land didn't shout its thaw. It whispered it, slow, sure, like the house had learned to do. Inside, change didn't come all at once, but it came. The primer book now lived on the table. Tisa read aloud in the mornings, voice careful, but growing steadier each day. Her limp was still there, but lighter, and her eyes no longer flicked to the door. When the wind stirred too fast, she'd taken to calling the old cow sister. Jed didn't correct her. Chenoa mended the curtains again, but this time with colored thread, soft blue, like the scarf. And when Jed headed out to the barn to check on the new foals, she was already there, one hand resting steady on the flank of a colt, whispering something soft, in a language the colt clearly understood. Even if Jed didn't, he watched her for a long moment. The way she moved, like she'd always belonged to the land. The way she didn't flinch anymore. That evening, they ate together on the porch. No words, no stories, but their silence had changed again. It no longer built walls. It laid down quilts, a kind of language all its own. Tisa came out last, carrying wildflowers, crooked, wind-bitten, but proud. She placed them in an old tin cup, set them gently at the center of the table. Jed didn't move them, didn't need to. Later, with the lantern lit, Chenoa joined him on the porch. No snow now, no storm, just the hush of dusk and the far-off call of nighthawks, carving shadows through the sky. You still hear her? She asked, not looking at him. Jed didn't speak for a long time. Then, less like a voice now, more like a rhythm, like something waiting in the quiet parts of the day. Chenoa nodded. I think she's proud that you kept the fire going this long. Jed looked at her. I didn't think I was She gave the softest smile. You were? They stood there a while longer, shoulder to shoulder. No touching, no naming whatever had begun to grow, just breathing the same air, staring into the same dark. When Jed woke the next morning, the scarf was still draped over the chair, not folded, not packed away, used, lived in, trusted, and beside it, on the table, a small carving of a bird, cedar, smooth, unfinished. Tisa's doing, maybe, or Chinoa's. He turned it over in his hand, ran a thumb along the grain, then set it on the mantel, just beside the lantern, let it live there. Later that day, Chinoa saddled the mare. Tisa climbed up behind her. They rode out toward the creek, not to leave, just to explore. Jed watched them until the trees swallowed their shapes, then turned back toward the barn. Inside, the feed was stacked, the gate latch repaired, and on the post, beneath two familiar names, he saw his own carved clean. Chenoa, Tisa, Jed. Not cattle names, not markers of what had been lost, but of what had been found. Part 5. The lantern still burns. By the time the thaw came in full, the land looked different, not just in color, but in rhythm. The front gate no longer creaked when it opened. Boots lined the porch 2 pairs at a time, and sometimes laughter spilled from the house. Not loud, not constant, but enough. Jed never asked how long they'd stay. Chenoa never promised they would, but neither one of them spoke about leaving. And sometimes, that's all a promise needs. One morning, after gathering eggs from the hen coop, Jed paused beside the cottonwood cross, where his wife lay buried. The ground had softened now. The frost was gone. He didn't kneel, didn't speak, just stood, hut in hand, and laid something at the base of the marker, a ribbon of blue fabric, frayed, weather-worn. Not the whole scarf, just a piece, wrapped around a small bundle of cedar shavings and wind-bitten wildflowers. A farewell and a thank you. That evening, the sheriff rode by, didn't dismount, didn't speak, just tipped his hat toward the porch, where Jed sat in a slow, steady rock, carving knife in hand, Chenoa nearby, sewing under lantern light. And in the doorway, Tisa slept, wrapped in the same quilt Jed's wife had stitched decades ago. The wind returned that night, not cruel, not sharp, just passing through. No threat, no riders, just memory. Jed lit the lantern, same as always, but this time, he didn't go back inside. He stayed on the porch, watching the flame flicker soft against the window pane. Chenoa joined him quietly, said nothing, just leaned into his side, her head resting against his shoulder. And for the first time since the fire, since the silence, since the hurt, Chedudia Boon closed his eyes without fear. Some stories don't end in gunfire. Some end with a chair turned toward dusk and someone choosing to sit beside you when they don't have to. The next morning, the carved bird was gone from the mantel. In its place, a new one, wings half open, head turned skyward, not perfect, but trying. Beneath it, one Annie. And a researcher written in a child's hand. We stay, if that's okay. Tisa. Jed folded the note, placed it gently in the drawer. He didn't need to answer. The scarf still hung on the peg, but it didn't feel like a memory anymore. It felt like part of the house. He stepped outside, took off his gloves, and started carving again. Not names this time, feathers. Into the barn door, into the gatepost, into the place he used to call his past. Now, he called it something else, home. The fire that stayed lit by the time the last frost gave way to green. Wind Hollow didn't look like a place someone had survived. It looked like a place someone had returned to, even if they'd never been there before. Jed never told the town what happened. never explained why two barefoot girls walked onto his land one winter and never left. He didn't owe the world a story, but he gave them something quieter, a porch light that stayed on, a scarf that stayed folded, a life that kept going, not louder, but truer. Because not all love stories begin with a kiss. Some start with a man leaving the door unlatched and a girl sewing the curtain back together. With quiet, steady hands, some begin in the snow and end in the sound of breath beside you. And so, the lantern still burns, not for grief, not for memory, but for the small, sacred hope that someone, somewhere, might still be trying to find their way home. Tell us, what did this story stir in you? Drop your thoughts in the comments and rate it from 0 to 10. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a ride. If this story touched something in you, the next one goes even deeper. And if you've ever left the door unlatched, not out of fear, but out of faith that someone might walk through, type, "The lantern is still burning." Thank you for sitting by the fire with us tonight. We'll leave the light on. See you at the next story.